The state of Texas is suing Johnson & Johnson, the makers of Tylenol, on the basis of an alleged correlation between prenatal consumption of acetaminophen and autism spectrum disorder. The lawsuit can be summarized in 3 steps. Johnson & Johnson knew or ought to have known of the alleged correlation. They concealed the alleged correlation.
And then they proceeded to try to shield their assets from the consequences of their behavior.
You son of a bitch.
Viva Fry, former Montreal litigator turned current Florida rumbler, in my home office, and many of you may or may not have heard about this story. The state of Texas is suing Johnson & Johnson for the alleged correlation between prenatal consumption of acetaminophen and autism spectrum disorder. And the question is, if you had not heard about this lawsuit, why did you not hear about this lawsuit? It might be because the legacy media is none too keen to cover one of the stories that implicates one of their biggest sponsors, Big Pharma.
Brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch, sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
And now I've got to pause for a second while the garbage truck behind me collects our garbage. All right, there we go. Let's get to the article from CNN. This is news from just a couple of days ago. CNN Health. Texas Attorney General sues Tylenol makers claiming links to autism. Updated October 28, 2025 by Jacqueline Howard. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has filed a lawsuit against the companies Johnson & Johnson and Kenvue, claiming that they, quote, deceptively, end quote, marketed Tylenol to pregnant mothers and that the medication is tied to an increased risk of autism. Kenvue said in a statement that the medication is safe and the company will, quote, vigorously defend, end quote, against the claims. The lawsuit, dated Monday and filed in the District Court of Panola County, Texas, comes about a month after President Donald Trump publicly claimed that the use of Tylenol during pregnancy can be associated with an increased risk of autism in the child, despite decades of evidence that the medication is safe. Pause right now and appreciate that CNN is not reporting the news. Right there, they are inserting a commentary, and you have to ask yourself, are they an outlet reporting on the news, or are they basically a spokesperson of Big Pharma? When you see who funds these legacy media companies, you'll have your answer.
ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Pfizer.
Quote, Big Pharma betrayed America by profiting off pain and pushing pills regardless of the risks. These corporations lied for decades, knowingly endangering millions to line their pockets, end quote. Paxton, the state's Republican Attorney General, who is also running for U.S. Senate, said in a news release Tuesday, quote, by holding Big Pharma accountable for poisoning our people, we will help make America healthy again, end quote. The lawsuit claims that Johnson & Johnson and Kenvue violated the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Consumer Protection Act because they knew that acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, quote, is dangerous to unborn children and young children, end quote, and, quote, they hid this danger and deceptively marketed Tylenol as the only safe painkiller for pregnant women, end quote, according to the lawsuit. All right, we don't need to rely on CNN's summary of the lawsuit. I got the lawsuit. I went to go to the key allegations to understand what exactly they were alleging of Johnson & Johnson and Kenvue, and it goes like this. 1, they knew or ought to have known of the risks. They concealed the risks, and then at the end, they also did some corporate restructuring to try to shield their assets from the potential consequences of their knowledge and lack of acting on their knowledge. And here you have it. Page 1, the state of Texas plaintiff versus Johnson & Johnson, Kenvue Inc., Kenvue Brands LLC, Johnson & Johnson Consumer Inc. In the District of Panola County, Texas, plaintiff's original petition. For decades, defendant Johnson & Johnson, Kenvue Inc., and Kenvue Brands LLC knew that acetaminophen, Tylenol's active ingredient, is dangerous to unborn children and young children, yet they hid this danger and deceptively marketed Tylenol as the only safe painkiller for pregnant women, violating the Texas Deceptive Trade Practices Consumer Protection Act, DTPA, as mounting scientific evidence linked prenatal and early childhood exposure to acetaminophen with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Johnson & Johnson saw a reckoning on the horizon rather than take responsibility. Johnson & Johnson fraudulently transferred its Tylenol-related liabilities to Kenvue Inc. and Kenvue Brands LLC, together Kenvue, in violation of the Texas Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, UFTA, to shield its ill-gotten assets from the families they harmed. As you are all undoubtedly aware, last month Trump made history with RFK Jr. coming out and saying that basically there is a correlation between prenatal consumption of acetaminophen and autism spectrum disorder, and whether or not you agree with the statement, there are allegedly studies that confirm that correlation, and the lawsuit makes hard reference to those studies, which they allege Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiary companies ignored to make more money. Paragraph 64 of the lawsuit, acetaminophen use by pregnant women leads to children with ASD and ADHD. For years, the scientific evidence has shown that acetaminophen acetaminophen can cause ASD and ADHD in children whose mothers ingested the drug while pregnant, and that the more acetaminophen ingested, the greater the risk. Paragraph 65, parental awareness and changes in diagnoses do not account for the rapid rise in ASD and ADHD diagnoses or for the higher prevalence in the United States as compared to the rest of the world. Footnote 40. And here you have something written by William Shaw, evidence that increased acetaminophen use in genetically vulnerable children appears to be a major cause of the epidemics of autism, attention deficit with hyperactivity, and asthma. Now, many of you out there, especially those of you working for legacy media who are funded by these big pharma companies and rely on them as your source of revenue, you might be very reluctant to talk bad about them. I'm not funded by big pharma, so I can at least be objective. You might say, yeah, there's a whole body of literature out there. There's a whole body of science that confirms no correlation between acetaminophen use, even in pregnant women, prenatal women, and ASD, ADHD. There's a whole body of literature out there confirming that this is not the case, debunking the myth. Well, there are at least a few studies out there confirming it, and this lawsuit makes reference to a lot of them. So you can say, well, my sources are better than yours, but you cannot say that those sources do not exist. And according to the lawsuit, those sources exist. Johnson & Johnson was well aware of them, which is why they not only ignored them and sought to discredit them, they then sought to shield their assets from the consequences of what they knew to be true. And again, these are mere allegations in a lawsuit. They are not proven fact. We will see how it pans out once there has been a full evidentiary hearing, but for the time being, they are allegations that we must read. Paragraph 66, one article noted that, quote, a country's average prenatal acetaminophen consumption was found to be correlated with its autism/ASD prevalence, end quote, with an R of 0.80, which suggests a strong correlation. Footnote 41. Paragraph 67, another study noted that, quote, the marked increase in the rate of autism and attention deficit with hyperactivity may be largely caused by the marked increase in the use of acetaminophen by pregnant women, end quote. Footnote 42. Paragraph 68. Since 2013, scientists examining over 70,000 mother-child pairs in at least 6 European birth cohort studies have shown an association between prenatal use of acetaminophen and ASD and ADHD. Still not convinced, you big pharma-funded corporate legacy media whores? Let's go on with more of the allegations, shall we?
We shall.
Paragraph 83. Another peer-reviewed study published in 2020 avoided maternal self-reporting or incomplete information regarding the quantity of acetaminophen ingested by analyzing the child's meconium. This approach allowed the study's authors to reliably know the baby's exposure to acetaminophen prior to birth because the exposure level can be measured in the first feces of a newborn infant. Besides the meconium analysis, this study tracked the children to assess whether there was a physician diagnosis of ADHD and undertook an MRI analysis of each study participant at 9 to 11 years old. Compared with no acetaminophen, detection of acetaminophen in meconium was associated with a statistically significant increased risk of ADHD. Notably, a dose-response association was detected. Each doubling of exposure increased the odds of ADHD by 10%. Children with acetaminophen detected in meconium also showed brain development problems. Paragraph 84, these quote results suggested that prior studies may have been biased towards the null by inaccurate maternal recall, end quote. In other words, past studies may have had a bias towards there not being an association when in fact there may be an association, meaning that those prior studies may have understated the association between acetaminophen and ADHD. Paragraph 85, the epidemiologic evidence is fortified by consistent animal studies, neuroscience studies, and empirical evidence that demonstrate viable biologic mechanisms by which acetaminophen causes ASD and ADHD and impactful real-world effects. This consistent epidemiologic, animal, neuroscience, and empirical evidence has led independent physicians and scientists to demand that women be warned about the dangerous effects acetaminophen can have on their unborn children. The lawsuit goes hard on footnotes and sources. I won't belabor the point, but you get the idea. Then the lawsuit moves into how Johnson & Johnson knew of this or ought to have known about this and pushed back to discredit these unfavorable sources. Paragraph 99, the evidence was so alarming it went to high-level executives at Johnson & Johnson, including the CEO. Paragraph 100, Johnson & Johnson's pushback strategy continued after publication of the 2016 JAMA pediatric study, with Johnson & Johnson's senior executives again directing Johnson & Johnson's and JJCI's messaging to undermine the study. Paragraph 101, that pattern continued in 2018 when Johnson & Johnson's global communications team again led the effort to undermine the Bornehag study, steering the media to the Consumer Healthcare Products Association, quote, the national trade association representing the leading manufacturers and marketers of consumer healthcare products, end quote, for reaction on the part of Johnson & Johnson and JJCI. Paragraph 105, on information and belief, Johnson & Johnson used Baby Center to promote Tylenol as safe to use during pregnancy under the guise that it was coming from a neutral party, babycenter.com, and not the maker of Tylenol. For example, the website included information from a, quote, genetic counselor, end quote, that acetaminophen was safe to take during pregnancy despite the studies above linking prenatal use of acetaminophen to neurodevelopmental disorders. Paragraph 106, based on information and belief, Johnson & Johnson's highest executives were engaged in the misconduct and cover-up regarding prenatal use of Tylenol and neurodevelopmental disorders, including ASD and ADHD. Paragraph 107, defendant's pattern of deflection and silence has continued to the present day. None has taken any steps to warn pregnant women of the dangers associated with taking acetaminophen while pregnant. Paragraph 108, for example, a defendant ran this advertisement, quote, Mother's Day, celebrating the moms who care without limits, end quote, and reinforced its message that Tylenol is safe for pregnant women. The lawsuit goes on to say that the defendants have the ability and, nay, the obligation to update the warnings on their products, and they have not updated the warning on Tylenol to suggest that there might be some cause for concern of a correlation between prenatal use of acetaminophen and certain neurodevelopmental disorders in children. The lawsuit then goes on to further highlight and emphasize the presumption of knowledge on the part of Johnson & Johnson as determined by its conduct afterwards. Paragraph 131, based on information and belief, Johnson & Johnson has directed its subsidiary, Janssen Research and Development, LLC, Janssen, to track ASD behaviors and other events. Janssen operates the Janssen Autism Knowledge Engine, JAKE, which is a, quote, system of tools and technologies to optimize clinical trials for ASD, end quote. The JAKE system was developed to facilitate the testing of medications that may treat the symptoms of ASD. Paragraph 134, through the MyJake web and mobile application, a user can, quote, log symptoms, demarcate events of interest, record treatments and medical information, and track overall study progress, end quote, for someone with ASD. This data is collected and stored in the, quote, Janssen Research Data Warehouse, end quote, where Janssen can analyze that data with data collected from JakeSense biosensors. If this doesn't sound like an unholy marriage between George Orwell's 1984 and Minority Report, I don't know what does, but the bottom line, one of Johnson & Johnson's subsidiaries is collecting data on autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders in order to treat the symptoms. We'll see where this goes in the context of the lawsuit because it's not immaterial. Paragraph 144, upon information and belief, Johnson & Johnson knew that claims linked to Tylenol causing ASD and ADHD could potentially subject it to billions of dollars in liability. Paragraph 145, on November 12, 2021, Johnson & Johnson began the process of, quote, peeling off, end quote, its consumer health business, including Tylenol. As one analyst noted, quote, if the consumer division no longer holds the deep pockets of the combined company, the risk of future consumer product litigation may decrease, end quote. Paragraph 146, in 2022, dozens of lawsuits were filed against acetaminophen sellers around the country regarding the neurodevelopmental harms caused by prenatal use of acetaminophen. The claims in federal court were consolidated into a multi-district litigation on October 5, 2022. Paragraph 147, on April 24, 2023, Johnson & Johnson announced that it planned to take Kenvue Inc. public. When the initial public offering closed on May 8, 2023, Johnson & Johnson held, quote, approximately 89.6% of the total outstanding shares of Kenvue Inc. common stock, end quote, with, quote, intention to dispose of its majority stake in Kenvue Inc., end quote, later that year. The initial public offering was, quote, partial consideration for the consumer health business that Johnson & Johnson transferred to Kenvue Inc., end quote. Tylenol was part of that transfer. And the corporate punchline at paragraph 148 on August 23, 2023, Kenvue Inc., quote, announced its separation from Johnson & Johnson, marking its first day as a fully independent company, end quote. By the time Kenvue Inc. announced it was separating, Johnson & Johnson had only, quote, 9.5% of the outstanding shares of Kenvue Inc. common stock, end quote. On May 13, 2024, Kenvue Inc. announced that Johnson & Johnson would sell off its remaining stake. Now, what might that actually do in practice? Well, if Kenvue doesn't have quite the depths of the pockets of Johnson & Johnson, it might deter or otherwise frustrate litigation in the event that there is, in fact, a causal link between acetaminophen and certain developmental disorders in children. So yeah, you make it a little bit more difficult for people to sue, and in the event that they succeed, to collect on their judgments. And this potentially fraudulent, deceptive conduct is summarized in count 2, but let's get to count 1 of the lawsuit first. Count 1, DTPA violations, all defendants. Paragraph 166, and I won't read the entire thing. Defendants have, while engaged in trade and commerce, engaged in false, misleading, and deceptive acts and practices declared unlawful by section 17.46A and B of the DTPA, including but not limited to A, representing directly or by implication that Tylenol does not pose a risk to children when their mothers consume the drug while pregnant. B, representing directly or by implication that Tylenol does not pose a risk to young children who consume the drug. C, representing directly or by implication that it is safe for pregnant women to take Tylenol. D, representing directly or by implication that it is safe for young children to take Tylenol. And you get the idea. Then we get into the UFTA unfair trade practices and the potential alleged selling off of assets to make it more difficult for people to sue and collect on their judgments. More simply put, a method of Johnson & Johnson to
Cover its assets.
Count 2, UFTA violations, all defendants. Paragraph 168, the UFTA prohibits a debtor from transferring assets to prevent creditors from recovering the value of their or claim without receiving appropriate compensation for the assets. Paragraph 169, the UFTA prohibits a debtor from incurring a debt with the intent to hinder, delay, or defraud any creditor. Skip to paragraph 174, upon information and belief, Johnson & Johnson has known for many years that its Tylenol products could cause ASD and ADHD in children when their mothers consume the drug while pregnant. Paragraph 175, upon information and belief, Johnson & Johnson has known for many years that its Tylenol products could cause ASD and ADHD in children when young children take the drug. Paragraph 176, Kenvue has known since it was formed that its Tylenol products could cause ASD and ADHD in children when their mothers consume the drug while pregnant. Paragraph 179, upon information and belief, Johnson & Johnson knew that claims of this nature could potentially subject it to billions of dollars in liability. Paragraph 180, Johnson & Johnson incorporated JNTL Inc., the company that would eventually be known as Kenvue Inc., on February 23, 2022, as a Delaware corporation. Paragraph 181, when the initial public offering for Kenvue Inc. closed on May 8, 2023, Johnson & Johnson held the vast majority of Kenvue Inc. common stock. By August 2023, Johnson & Johnson had divested its majority stake down to 9.5% of Kenvue Inc.'s common stock. In May 2024, Johnson & Johnson intended to divest this remaining stake. Paragraph 182, upon information and belief, to protect itself from liability for claims like those at issue here, Johnson & Johnson transferred its Tylenol assets and liabilities to Kenvue. Paragraph 183, this maneuver was a direct attempt by Johnson & Johnson to insulate itself from liabilities arising from consumer health products such as Tylenol by transferring its assets and liabilities to Kenvue. Paragraph 184, Kenvue incurred a debt intended to hinder, delay, or defraud creditors. Paragraph 186, this conduct is prohibited by the UFTA regardless of whether defendants intended this result and regardless of whether defendants knew of the state's specific claims before the transfer. Paragraph 187, as a direct and proximate result of defendants' actions, the state has been harmed in that it may be unable to recover full value for its claims. Jury trial demand. So that is the lawsuit, but first and foremost, if you like what I do, make sure that you like, share, subscribe, turn on notifications, share my channel and a video with someone who you think would like it, but most importantly, share it with someone who you think would not like it because they might need it the most. But that is the lawsuit, and Texas is leading the charge against Johnson & Johnson, another company which produced another product which may or may not have caused some certain harms for which they were shielded from liability. But alas, as George Carlin said, it's one big club and we sure as hell ain't in it. That's the lawsuit. We'll follow it and see where it goes. We will talk about it during Sunday night's show, Viva and Barnes Law for the People, but most importantly, exercise, eat healthy sunlight, talk to people in real life, and now you know your vlog. Peace out, peeps. Booyah!